Officer James Colton's day began like any other. The quiet, predictable routine of patrolling his small town was something he had come to rely on. Years on the force had dulled the initial excitement that once made him proud to wear the badge. Now, it felt more like just a job, one he did out of duty, not passion. As he drove through the familiar streets, his mind wandered to the stack of paperwork waiting for him back at the station. The day promised to be uneventful, and in a way, he was grateful for that. He had been a cop for over 15 years in this town. Everyone knew him, and he knew them. Colton wasn't one for small talk, but people respected him. The locals had their opinions about him, but none of it ever bothered him much. He was the kind of officer who followed the rules to the letter and didn't take any nonsense. Colton wasn't known for his patience. If you crossed the line, even a little, you would hear about it. Some of the newer recruits admired him, while others saw him as a relic of a time when cops didn't care much for niceties. But that day was different. From the moment he stepped out of his squad car, he could feel something in the air. The protest that had been brewing for days had finally reached the town square. The demonstration was about a new policy proposal that would change how local law enforcement handled certain issues, including increased accountability and citizen oversight. For some, it was a necessary change. For others, it was an attack on the force. Colton fell into the latter group, though he hadn't spoken much about it. As he walked toward the square, he could see the crowd already gathering. Signs were held high, chants filled the air, and the mood was tense but controlled. Colton wasn't the officer in charge of the protest today, but he'd been called in as backup in case things got out of hand. He knew the drill. Stay on the sidelines, keep an eye out for troublemakers, and step in only when necessary. Protests like these had a way of escalating without warning. One moment, people were chanting and holding signs, and the next, things could spiral out of control. He'd seen it before. Standing near the edge of the crowd, he scanned the faces. Most of them were familiar, people he'd grown up around, neighbors, business owners, and young activists who had moved into town in recent years. But one face stood out to him, and not because he knew her. It was a woman standing near the front, her face calm but resolute. She wasn't holding a sign, wasn't chanting, just observing. She seemed to radiate a quiet authority, as if she didn't need to shout to make her presence known. Colton watched her for a moment longer than he intended, something about her catching his attention. Before he could think more about it, a commotion broke out on the other side of the square. A few of the protesters had begun arguing with a group of counter-protesters. Tensions flared, and Colton could feel the energy in the crowd shift from uneasy to volatile. He stepped forward, ready to intervene if necessary. Suddenly, the argument escalated into a physical altercation. Shoving, yelling, the crackle of someone's voice over a megaphone calling for calm. Colton rushed forward, his adrenaline spiking as he pushed through the crowd. A small group had surrounded the woman he'd noticed earlier. It wasn't clear what had happened, but the situation was deteriorating fast. Without thinking, Colton moved into action. The training he'd relied on for years kicked in. He shoved his way through the people, grabbing one of the protesters by the arm to pull them back. The woman at the center of the chaos was caught in the middle, and in the confusion, Colton's focus was solely on de-escalating the situation. He shouted for people to back up, his voice booming over the crowd, but the noise was deafening, and no one was listening. Then it happened. A flash of movement from the corner of his eye, a protester lunging forward, and instinct took over. Colton swung, connecting his fist with someone in front of him, hoping to stop the escalation before it got worse. His punch landed hard, and the crowd seemed to freeze for a split second. People gasped. The noise stopped, and in that brief moment, Colton realized something had gone terribly wrong. The woman stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face where his punch had landed. The crowd parted, revealing her stunned expression, eyes wide with shock. Time seemed to slow down as Colton stood there, fist still clenched, realizing he hadn't just struck some random protester. The woman he had hit wasn't part of the chaos. She had been trying to calm it. Everything seemed to happen at once after that. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, and someone yelled, "That's her. Oh my God, that's her." Confusion swirled in Colton's mind. Who was she? He had no idea what they were talking about, but he could see the horror on people's faces, and then the whispers started to spread like wildfire. "She's the new chief," someone said, loud enough for Colton to hear. The words hit him like a freight train. Chief. He couldn't have heard that right. But as the crowd parted even further, it became clear. He had just punched Lisa Turner, the newly appointed chief of police for the city. She had been officially sworn in only a few days ago. And now, here she was, crumpled on the ground, holding her cheek where Colton's fist had struck her. The blood drained from Colton's face as the realization set in. He had just assaulted his new boss, in front of an entire town, in the middle of a protest that was already on the verge of boiling over. For a moment, everything went silent in his head. The noise of the crowd, the shouting, even his own heartbeat, it all faded into a numb hum. He had made a mistake, a massive, career-ending mistake. Colton's instincts screamed at him to run, to do anything to escape the situation. But he was frozen in place, his legs refusing to move. He could see Lisa struggling to get back on her feet, people rushing to help her, and the sudden surge of activity around her was almost dizzying. In that moment, all he could think about was the weight of his career collapsing around him. 15 years on the force, and it was all going to be over because of one mistake, one punch thrown in the heat of the moment. People began pulling out their phones, capturing the chaos, their faces a mix of horror, curiosity, and excitement at the drama unfolding in front of them. Social media was about to explode, and Colton knew it. His name, his face, it would be all over the internet before the day was done. In the distance, he heard sirens approaching, the unmistakable sound of more officers being dispatched to deal with the fallout of what had just happened. Colton felt a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't turn to see who it was. He couldn't take his eyes off Lisa, who was now standing, rushing off the people who were trying to help her. Despite the situation, she held herself with a calmness that unnerved him. She looked directly at him, her expression unreadable. And in that moment, Colton's world collapsed. He knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The minutes after the punch felt like hours to Officer Colton. He could hardly believe what he had done. Every second dragged as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, crushing him under a mix of regret and disbelief. The crowd that had been shouting and pushing moments earlier now seemed frozen in time, eyes wide, phones pointed directly at him, capturing the aftermath of his blunder. Colton's chest tightened, his mouth was dry, and the taste of metal lingered on his tongue. Lisa Turner, the woman he'd struck, stood only a few feet away now, her hand still on her cheek, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said a word since she stood back up. Her silence, more than any amount of shouting or reprimand, chilled Colton to the core. A few people were trying to help her, offering her water and asking if she needed medical attention, but she waved them off gently, still keeping her eyes fixed on him. The sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup. Colton's colleagues, people he had worked alongside for years, were about to show up and see the chaos he caused. He could feel their judgment even before they arrived. The adrenaline that had fueled him moments ago was draining fast, leaving behind only a sick, hollow feeling in his gut. He felt naked, exposed, knowing that not just his fellow officers, but the entire town would soon know about his colossal mistake. In his peripheral vision, Colton saw one of the protest leaders approaching Lisa cautiously. It was a young man he recognized, Josh Alvarez, a prominent local activist who had organized similar demonstrations in the past. Josh was known for his fiery speeches and unrelenting criticism of law enforcement. He had no love for cops, least of all someone like Colton, who represented everything Josh and his followers wanted to change about the police force. "Are you okay, Chief Turner?" Josh asked, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The crowd quieted even more, straining to catch every word of the exchange. It was clear that many expected Lisa to lash out, to demand justice, or at the very least reprimand Colton in front of everyone. But instead, Lisa nodded calmly, still not taking her eyes off Colton. "I'm fine," she said simply, her voice steady. She seemed more concerned with studying Colton than with the protesters or the gathering police cars, now pulling up along the edge of the square. Colton had never felt so vulnerable in his life. His fists were clenched, but this time not out of anger. He desperately wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize. Anything to break the unbearable tension between him and the woman he had just struck. But no words came. What could he say that wouldn't sound like a weak excuse? A few of his fellow officers stepped out of their cars, immediately surveying the scene. One of them, Sergeant Ramirez, caught Colton's eye as he moved towards the crowd. Ramirez had been on the force even longer than Colton, and the look on his face when he realized what had happened was one of pure disbelief. Ramirez hurried over, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "What the hell happened here, Colton?" Ramirez demanded, pulling him aside. "I'm hearing all kinds of crazy things." Colton's throat tightened, and he opened his mouth to speak, but before he could answer, Lisa Turner stepped forward, cutting through the tension. "Sergeant Ramirez," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I'd like to speak with Officer Colton alone." Ramirez glanced between Colton and Lisa, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Chief, I think it would be better if we—" "Alone," Lisa repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Colton couldn't believe what he was hearing. Why would she want to speak to him privately after what had just happened? Every instinct he had told him to refuse, to get out of there before things got worse, but there was no refusing her, not in front of this many people. He nodded stiffly, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. The crowd slowly began to disperse under the supervision of the other officers, but not without murmurs and whispers spreading through the square. Colton could hear fragments of conversations, people speculating about his future, about what would happen next. The protest might have been about police reform, but now the focus had shifted entirely to him and his mistake. Lisa gestured for Colton to follow her away from the square, and he obeyed silently. They walked towards a quieter section of the park, just out of earshot of the remaining crowd, but still within view of the patrol cars. Colton's mind raced, desperately trying to anticipate what she might say. He had no idea what to expect. Was this going to be his immediate suspension? His final chance to defend himself? Or something worse? When they stopped, Lisa turned to face him. She was still holding her cheek where he had struck her, though the swelling had already begun to show. Her eyes were sharp, but not filled with the anger Colton expected. There was something else, something he couldn't quite place. "Officer Colton," she began, her voice firm, but not harsh. "Do you know who I am?" Colton swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, ma'am. I had no idea who you were when it happened. I swear, I thought—" "I know what you thought," Lisa interrupted, her gaze steady. "And I understand that situations like this can get out of hand. But that doesn't change the fact that you hit me, and you didn't take the time to assess the situation before you acted." Colton's stomach churned. The shame he had been holding back was rising to the surface now, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Chief. I really am." Lisa sighed, finally lowering her hand from her face. "I'm not here to hear your apology, Colton. I'm here because this town needs to know that we can handle situations like this with more than just punishment. The community's watching us. They're watching you. How we handle this is going to define more than just your career." Colton frowned, unsure of where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" Lisa's expression softened just a bit. "I've been a cop long enough to know that things aren't always black and white. You made a mistake, a serious one. But I'm not interested in firing you or dragging this out in court. That's not going to fix the problem. Colton's heart pounded. Then, what are you going to do? For the first time since the incident, Lisa smiled faintly. I want you to own this, Colton. Not just with an apology, but with action. You're going to help me fix this department from the inside. You're going to work with me to rebuild trust in the community. And that means facing what you've done head on. No hiding, no excuses. Colton blinked, struggling to process what she was saying. You want me to? Yes, she cut him off, her tone growing firmer. I want you to take responsibility in a way that matters. You're going to lead by example. The public needs to see that officers like you can change, that you're willing to grow from your mistakes. This isn't just about you, Colton. It's about all of us. Colton's mind raced. He had expected punishment, maybe even the end of his career, but this was something he hadn't seen coming. Lisa was giving him a way out, but it wasn't going to be easy. She was offering him redemption, but the price was high. He'd have to face the community he had wronged and prove that he could be better. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Colton felt the weight of her words settle on him like a heavy coat. The crowd had mostly dispersed now, but he knew that the real challenge was just beginning. He had no idea if he was ready for it, but one thing was clear. Lisa wasn't going to let him hide from it. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. Lisa's faint smile returned, and she extended her hand to him. Good. Then let's get to work. As Colton shook her hand, he realized that his life, and the town, would never be the same again. Officer Colton sat alone in the station break room, staring at his cup of coffee. The steam rising from the cup blurred his vision, though it wasn't the coffee that had his mind swirling. It was everything that had happened over the last 24 hours. His career, once so stable, now hung in the balance, and he had no one to blame but himself. Lisa Turner's offer weighed heavily on him. He had expected her to come down on him hard, to take away his badge, and make an example of him in front of the entire town. But instead, she had chosen to give him an opportunity for redemption, an opportunity he wasn't sure he deserved. Outside the break room, the station buzzed with activity. Phones rang, officers moved briskly between desks, and the usual chatter filled the air. Colton used to be a part of that rhythm, moving with purpose, handling his work with the confidence that came from years of experience. Now, he felt like an outsider. His colleagues hadn't spoken much to him since the incident at the protest. He knew they were talking about him, though. They didn't have to say it to his face. He could see it in their eyes, the way they avoided direct contact, the awkward nods they gave him when they passed by. Colton had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, but with Lisa's decision to handle things her way, that process had been expedited. It wasn't just his future on the line, though. The whole town had become embroiled in the aftermath of his mistake. The protest at the square had shifted from being about police reform to being about him. His name was in the news, his face plastered across social media, and every conversation in town seemed to circle back to what had happened. Some people were outraged, calling for his resignation, demanding accountability. Others, mostly those who had known him for years, defended him, insisting it had been an honest mistake. Colton had seen the comments online too. The endless stream of opinions from people who didn't know him, who didn't know anything about the situation but felt entitled to pass judgment anyway. It was overwhelming, and yet he couldn't stop himself from reading them. Every post, every comment, chipped away at the wall he had built around himself, and he felt more exposed than ever before. He hadn't slept much the night before. After his conversation with Lisa, he'd gone home and stared at the ceiling for hours, trying to process everything. Lisa had given him a path forward, but it wasn't going to be easy. She wanted him to take responsibility publicly, to become a visible part of the change she wanted to bring to the police force. That meant standing in front of the community he had let down and admitting his mistake. It meant facing the anger, the disappointment, and the scrutiny of people who had once trusted him. As Colton sat in the break room, lost in thought, The door creaked open. Sergeant Ramirez stepped in, his face a mask of concern and frustration. Ramirez was a good man, one of the few people on the force who had never shied away from speaking his mind, even when it wasn't what people wanted to hear. Colton had worked with him for over a decade, and they had shared plenty of tough moments on the job. Ramirez had always been a straight shooter, and Colton knew what was coming. "James," Ramirez said, sitting down across from him. He used Colton's first name, something he didn't do often. That alone told Colton this was more than just a casual conversation. "You okay?" Colton shrugged, his eyes still fixed on his cup of coffee. "I don't know, man. I guess I've been better." Ramirez leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "It's a mess out there, you know. People are angry. Some of the guys on the force aren't sure what's going to happen. They're worried about the department's reputation. And frankly, I don't blame them." Colton winced. He had expected this, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more real. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said quietly. It was a mistake. I lost control for a second. And now." Ramirez held up a hand to stop him. "I know it was a mistake, James, but it was a big one. And you know better than anyone that in this line of work, mistakes can cost people a lot more than just their pride." Colton nodded, the weight of Ramirez's words sinking in. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, to make the right call even in difficult situations. But at that protest, something had snapped. The tension, the anger in the crowd, the chaos. It had all pushed him over the edge. And now he was paying the price. "You talked to the chief," Ramirez continued, his voice more measured now. "She gave you an out. Not a lot of people would have done that. Most would have thrown you to the wolves." Colton finally looked up from his coffee, meeting Ramirez's eyes. "Yeah, she did. And I'm not sure I deserve it." Ramirez studied him for a moment before leaning forward, his voice lowering. "This town's changing, James. The people here, they want more accountability, more transparency from us. They don't trust us the way they used to, and you know why. Because of stuff like this. What happened yesterday is just another log on the fire. But it doesn't have to burn you down, not if you handle this right." Colton sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't know where to start. Lisa wants me to go out there, in front of everyone, and take the blame. She wants me to lead some kind of reform initiative. I'm not a politician, Ramirez. I don't even know if I'm the right person to be doing this." Ramirez's face softened slightly. "You're right. You're not a politician. But that's exactly why you are the right person. People aren't looking for some polished speech. They want to see someone who's real, someone who's made mistakes but is willing to own up to them. That's what Lisa sees in you, I think. You're the kind of guy who can stand up there and say, 'Yeah, I screwed up, but I'm going to do better.' And people need to see that." Colton swallowed hard. He knew Ramirez was right, but the thought of standing in front of the town and admitting his failure terrified him. He had spent his whole career trying to be the guy who didn't make mistakes, the officer who was always in control. Now that image was shattered. Before Colton could respond, the door to the break room opened again, and Lisa Turner walked in. She was dressed in her civilian clothes today, not her uniform, but she still carried the same air of authority. Her cheek was bruised, a stark reminder of what had happened at the protest. Colton's stomach churned at the sight of it. "Sergeant," Lisa said with a nod to Ramirez, before turning her attention to Colton. "Can we talk?" Ramirez took the cue and stood up. "I'll leave you two to it," he said, giving Colton a final, meaningful look before walking out of the room. Lisa sat down in the chair Ramirez had vacated, her expression calm but serious. Colton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of what to say. He had already apologized, but he wasn't sure if that was enough. "Officer Colton," Lisa began, her voice measured, "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened yesterday. And I want to make something clear. What you did was unacceptable, but I believe in second chances. However, a second chance comes with responsibility. Colton nodded, his throat tight. I understand, Chief. I'm ready to take responsibility. Lisa studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. I hope so, because this isn't going to be easy. The community is watching, and they want more than just words. They want action. I've arranged for a public forum tomorrow. You'll be there, and you'll address what happened. You're going to own up to your mistake in front of everyone. Colton's heart raced. A public forum. He hadn't expected this. Facing the people of the town, many of whom were furious with him, was a daunting prospect. But he knew this was part of the deal, part of the path to redemption that Lisa had laid out for him. I'll be there, he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Lisa nodded, her expression softening just a little. Good. I'm not looking for you to deliver some perfect speech, Colton. I want you to be honest. People can see through the bullshit. They know when someone's just telling them what they want to hear. You need to be real with them, or this will all fall apart. Colton took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to make things right. He had spent years on the force, building a reputation as a no-nonsense cop, but now he had to show the town that he was more than just a badge and a uniform. He had to prove that he could grow, that he could change. Lisa stood up, giving him one last look before turning to leave. I'll see you tomorrow, she said over her shoulder. Don't mess this up. Colton watched her go, his mind racing. Tomorrow, everything would be on the line. His career, his reputation. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, a heavy blanket of clouds hanging low in the sky, as if the universe itself were mourning the chaos that had unfolded just a day prior. Officer Colton stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his reflection staring back at him with hollow eyes. The weight of the day ahead felt like an anchor pulling him down. He had barely slept, tossing and turning as his mind replayed every detail of the protest, every second of the moment he had punched Lisa Turner, and now he was expected to face the town that had once trusted him. As he splashed water on his face, he could hear the distant sounds of the community gathering at the town hall. People were beginning to arrive for the forum, some eager for answers, others likely just waiting to unleash their frustrations. Colton finished getting ready, putting on his uniform for the first time since the incident. He hadn't felt worthy of it, but today he was going to wear it with a different purpose. It wasn't just a uniform, it was a symbol of accountability, and it was time he owned it. He arrived at the town hall early, the familiar sight of the brick building doing little to calm the turmoil in his stomach. Officers were setting up chairs, adjusting the microphones, and organizing the podium where he would soon stand. The air was thick with tension, and he could sense the nervous energy of his fellow officers as they went about their tasks. This wasn't just about him. It was about the entire police force, the community, and the future of law enforcement in their town. As the clock ticked closer to the start time, more people began to filter in. Colton recognized many faces in the crowd, fellow officers, community leaders, friends, and neighbors. And then there were the protesters, the ones who had rallied against him just a day ago, their expressions a mix of anger and curiosity. He felt exposed under their scrutiny, every judgment weighing heavily on his shoulders. When Lisa arrived, she exuded calm confidence. She moved through the crowd with purpose, greeting people and listening to their concerns. Colton admired her ability to engage with the community so effortlessly. She was the embodiment of the leadership they needed, and here he was, about to speak about his failure. He caught her eye, and she nodded reassuringly, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone in this. As the forum began, the room filled to capacity. Colton took a seat at the table, his heart racing as the audience settled in. Lisa stood at the front, her presence commanding attention. She welcomed everyone, laying out the purpose of the meeting, to address the incident that had occurred at the protest and to discuss the steps forward for the police department. Colton watched as she spoke, feeling a swell of pride for her bravery. She emphasized the importance of accountability, community involvement, and trust. It was the kind of message the town needed to hear, but now it was his turn to deliver a message of his own. When Lisa finally introduced him, Colton rose slowly, his legs feeling heavy as he made his way to the podium. The murmurs in the crowd faded into an unsettling silence, and he could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was the moment he had dreaded, but also knew he had to face. "Hello, everyone," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "I'm Officer James Colton, and I stand before you today not as your officer, but as someone who has made a grave mistake." He felt their eyes boring into him, scrutinizing every word, every emotion. "Yesterday at the protest, I lost control of my emotions, and I let my anger take over. I punched Chief Lisa Turner, a person who was trying to help de-escalate the situation. This isn't who I am, and it certainly isn't what I stand for as a law enforcement officer." As he spoke, Colton noticed the mixed reactions in the crowd. Some were nodding along, while others wore expressions of disbelief. He could feel their skepticism, and he knew he had to work hard to earn back their trust. "I'm here to take responsibility for my actions," he continued, trying to keep his voice steady. "What I did was unacceptable, and I understand that it has repercussions that extend beyond just me. It affects our entire department and our community. Trust is not easily regained, and I am fully aware of that." There was a moment of silence, and he could see Lisa nodding encouragingly from the corner of his eye. He pressed on, determined to be honest. "I know that some of you are angry with me, and you have every right to be. You deserve better from your officers, and I failed you. I failed to uphold the values of the badge I wear. And for that, I am truly sorry." As he spoke, he began to feel a shift in the atmosphere. The crowd was listening, some leaning forward in their seats. He was beginning to connect with them, sharing not just an apology, but an understanding of the greater issue at hand. "But I don't want this to be just about me. I want to be part of the solution, to help rebuild that trust, and to change the culture within our department." A murmur swept through the audience, and he could sense the cautious optimism in the air. "Lisa has given me a chance to work alongside her in implementing new policies for community policing. Together, we're going to foster transparency and accountability. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for your support as I work to be better, as we all strive to be better." Colton took a moment to gather his thoughts, knowing that this was a pivotal point in his speech. "I've learned that the badge I wear isn't just a symbol of authority. It's a commitment to serve and protect every single person in this town. I will not hide from my mistakes. Instead, I will use them as a catalyst for change." The audience began to shift in their seats, and he could see some faces softening. Perhaps it was the honesty in his voice, or the vulnerability he displayed. Either way, it felt as if he were slowly breaking down the walls he had unintentionally built around himself. "I know this isn't easy. It's not just about my redemption. It's about all of us coming together to create a community we can be proud of. We have to engage in difficult conversations about accountability and policing. I invite all of you to join us as we work toward meaningful reform," he finished, his heart pounding in his chest. There was a moment of silence before the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, a hesitant acceptance, perhaps. Colton stepped back from the podium, wiping the sweat from his brow, relieved but still aware that this was only the beginning. After the applause died down, Lisa stepped up to the microphone again, her presence radiating confidence. "Thank you, Officer Colton, for your honesty. Change doesn't come easy, but with voices like yours and the support of this community, we can build something better together." As the forum continued, people began to ask questions, voicing their concerns and suggestions for change. Colton listened intently, ready to engage in discussions that mattered. He felt a shift within himself as well. He was no longer just the officer who had made a mistake. He was now part of a larger conversation, a participant in the movement toward reform. The weight on his shoulders began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. But then, Just as the atmosphere began to feel more optimistic, an unexpected voice rose from the back of the room. And what about accountability for those who protect and serve? How can we trust you if you can't even control your own emotions? The question hung in the air, and Colton felt the blood drain from his face. It was a reminder that not everyone was ready to forgive or to believe in his newfound commitment. Lisa turned to him, and he could see the concern in her eyes. "Trust takes time," she said, stepping in. "And we're here to earn it, one step at a time. We want to listen, to engage, and to address your concerns openly. Change is a process, and we are committed to that process together." Colton nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. This was going to be a long road, filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. The community deserved better, and he was going to do everything he could to help make that happen. This was the start of something significant, not just for him, but for everyone involved. As the discussion continued, Colton felt the first sparks of hope flicker within him. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could turn this moment of crisis into a moment of growth for the entire town. As the forum continued, Colton felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation. The initial wave of applause had faded, replaced by a wave of questions that surged like a tide. Some were supportive, while others were sharp and probing. The scrutiny was intense, but it was a scrutiny he had brought upon himself, and he knew he needed to face it head-on. After the challenging question about accountability, several others followed. "How do we know this isn't just talk?" a woman in the audience asked, her arms crossed defiantly. "We've heard promises before, but nothing ever changes. Why should we believe you?" Colton swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He had to be honest. It was a fair question. "I understand your skepticism. We've all seen how easy it is for words to be hollow. But I want you to know that I'm not here to give you lip service. I'm here because I recognize that the system needs to change, and that starts with me." He could see some nodding, others still unsure. Lisa stood by his side, a supportive presence as she had been throughout this ordeal. Her gaze was steady, offering him strength as he spoke. Change isn't going to happen overnight. It will take time, hard work, and above all, accountability. From me, from the department, and from all of us. Another voice rang out from the back of the room. "What about training? Will you all get the training you need to handle these situations better?" Colton felt a sense of relief. This was an opportunity to share some tangible steps they were already planning. "Yes, we're already looking into implementing additional training programs, focusing on de-escalation techniques and mental health awareness. We want to prepare our officers to handle stress better and to respond appropriately in high-pressure situations. It's crucial that we understand how to keep our emotions in check, especially when tensions rise." As he spoke, he noticed a shift in the audience. They were engaged now, leaning forward, exchanging glances, weighing his words. Each question brought an opportunity to showcase the path ahead and their commitment to fostering real change. He felt the momentum building, and he leaned into it. "I've been given a chance to be part of this change," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "But it's not just my responsibility. It's all of ours. I want to hear from you, the community. Your voices matter, and your concerns need to be at the forefront of this initiative." The crowd began to murmur in agreement. A buzz of conversation filled the room, and Colton could feel the collective energy shifting. The tension that had hung in the air at the start of the forum was dissipating, replaced by a cautious optimism. He continued to answer questions, each response carefully considered, and each interaction felt like a step toward rebuilding trust. As the forum progressed, Lisa interjected, sharing her vision for the future of the police department and how they could collaborate with community members to create a new culture, one rooted in transparency and respect. The dialogue shifted toward actionable steps, and the community members began to share their ideas for engagement, from town hall meetings to community-led workshops. The conversation flowed, and Colton felt invigorated. For the first time since the incident, he could see a glimmer of hope. The community wasn't just interested in pointing fingers. They were invested in finding solutions. They were willing to be part of the process, to work alongside the police to create a better environment for everyone. But just as the atmosphere began to lighten, another voice cut through the discussion, this one filled with anger. And what about you? What kind of officer are you going to be now? How can we trust that you won't lose control again? Colton's heart sank. The question was harsh, but it was valid. He had to confront the reality of his actions. That's a fair point, he said, trying to keep his tone measured. I have to earn that trust back. I have to show you that I've learned from this mistake, and I'm committed to becoming a better officer. He looked out at the crowd, trying to connect with them. I know it won't be easy. Trust isn't built in a day, and it won't be rebuilt just because I say it should be. It will take time, effort, and openness. I'm willing to be part of that journey, but I need your support to make it happen. The audience seemed to resonate with his honesty. Colton could see some expressions soften, and there were nods of understanding. They were still wary, but he felt the seeds of a new relationship beginning to take root. As the forum wrapped up, Lisa thanked everyone for their participation and reiterated the importance of community engagement. This is just the beginning, she said, her voice full of conviction. We're in this together, and we're committed to making a difference. After the meeting, Colton felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had faced the community and shared his truths, but the work was far from over. The questions had been challenging, and he knew the road ahead would be fraught with obstacles. Yet he also felt a sense of hope that the town could come together, that they could create a new narrative for the police force, one that prioritized accountability and transparency. As people began to filter out of the town hall, Colton stayed behind, talking with community members who approached him. Each interaction was a small step, each conversation a chance to show that he was committed to change. He listened to their stories, their concerns, and their hopes for the future. Later that evening, as Colton returned home, he reflected on the day's events. The fog of uncertainty had begun to lift, replaced by a clearer vision of what was needed moving forward. He would need to work tirelessly to regain the trust of the community, to show that he was more than just an officer who had lost control. He was a part of this town, and it was time to start acting like it. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Colton dove into planning the community initiatives he had discussed at the forum. He worked closely with Lisa and other officers to outline training programs, public engagement events, and a series of workshops designed to foster communication between the police and the community. He was determined to turn the momentum from the forum into tangible results. As they laid out the plans, Colton felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was more than just his redemption. It was about building something lasting for the community, a platform for dialogue, a chance to heal the rift that had formed between law enforcement and the townspeople. The support from Lisa gave him confidence, but he knew it would take more than just her backing to make real change happen. One evening, after a long day of planning, Colton found himself sitting on his porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. The colors painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the tumult he had experienced recently. He took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the fading sunlight wash over him. It was a moment of calm amidst the chaos. He thought about how much had changed in such a short time. The incident that had threatened to derail his career had instead sparked a movement, not just for him, but for the entire police department. Colton knew there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. He had been given a second chance, and he intended to make the most of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting shadows across the yard, Colton felt a sense of determination settle within him. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new chances to prove that he was capable of being the officer the town deserved. He was ready to embrace the journey ahead, knowing that the road to redemption was just beginning. The days turned into weeks, and the momentum that Colton had felt following the community forum began to transform into tangible actions. Under Lisa's guidance, the police department rolled out a series of community engagement initiatives aimed at rebuilding trust and fostering open dialogue between law enforcement and the townspeople. Colton was at the forefront of these efforts, diving headfirst into planning workshops, community meetings, and training programs focused on de-escalation and mental health awareness. One of the first initiatives was a series of Coffee with a Cop events, where officers would meet residents at local cafes to discuss concerns, share ideas, and simply connect on a human level. Colton found himself surprisingly energized by these interactions. The first event was held at a popular diner on a Saturday morning, and as he walked through the doors, he was greeted by a mix of smiles and wary expressions. He understood the skepticism. He had been part of the problem, but he was determined to be part of the solution. As he took his seat at a table, a few familiar faces from the protest sat nearby, exchanging glances that conveyed a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Colton remembered their anger, their disillusionment with the police force. He felt a pang of regret, but pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. One by one, residents began to approach him, and what started as hesitant conversations soon blossomed into candid discussions. "Hey, Officer Colton," one man said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "I got to say, I didn't expect to see you here after everything that happened." Colton nodded, grateful for the opportunity to speak. "I get it. I know I have to earn back your trust, and I'm here to listen. What can we do better?" The man shifted in his seat, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. "I think the biggest thing is communication. We need to know you're on our side, that you're here to protect us, not just enforce rules. We want to be part of the conversation, you know." Colton felt a weight lift slightly. This was exactly what he wanted to hear. That's exactly what these events are for. We want to create a space where you can voice your concerns and suggestions. Your input is crucial for us to improve. As the morning wore on, more residents joined the conversation, sharing their experiences and hopes for the future. They discussed everything from community safety to the need for mental health resources, and Colton listened intently, taking notes and promising to bring their concerns back to the department. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond just enforcing the law. He was genuinely invested in fostering a community. Weeks passed, and Colton's schedule filled up with meetings, training sessions, and events. Each encounter brought him closer to the community, and he began to forge connections with residents he had once only seen from a distance. Some still remained skeptical, but many were willing to give him a chance, especially as they saw the police department actively working to implement changes. Meanwhile, Lisa remained a steady presence in his journey. Together, they worked on establishing new training protocols for officers, emphasizing empathy, de-escalation tactics, and community interaction. She pushed Colton to confront his fears and insecurities, encouraging him to step out of his comfort zone. "You've got to own your story, James," she told him during one of their planning sessions. "You can't let fear of failure hold you back. You've already faced the worst, and you came out on the other side. Now it's time to show everyone that you're committed to making a difference." Colton took her words to heart, realizing that each step he took was another opportunity to demonstrate his growth. He started to share his journey with his colleagues, opening up about the struggles he faced after the incident and how he was determined to change not just for himself, but for the entire department. One evening, after a particularly long day filled with training sessions, Colton returned home and sank into his couch. He picked up his phone and scrolled through social media, checking in on the community reactions to the initiatives they had launched. The comments were mostly positive, and he felt a swell of pride. But then he noticed a post that caught his eye, a video of him from a recent community meeting, where he had shared his story about the protest and his commitment to change. The comments beneath the video were mixed. Some praised his honesty, while others questioned whether he could truly change. "Is this just a PR stunt?" One user had written, "I hope he proves us wrong, but we've heard it all before." Colton closed his eyes, frustration bubbling to the surface. He knew that earning trust took time, but the doubt felt like an insurmountable obstacle. Just then, his phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Lisa. "Let's meet tomorrow to discuss the upcoming workshop. I want to hear your thoughts." The next day, Colton arrived at the station, where Lisa was already waiting in her office. "I saw your post on social media," she said as he walked in. "You seem frustrated. What's on your mind?" Colton ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of his thoughts. I'm trying so hard to show people that I'm committed to this, but it feels like for every step forward, there's someone ready to drag me 2 steps back. I know I can't change everyone's mind overnight, but it's disheartening to see that some people still think I'm just putting on a show." Lisa leaned back in her chair, considering his words. "Change is a slow process, James. The important thing is that you're taking action. You're not just talking the talk, you're walking the walk. People will notice that over time. Just keep being authentic and let your actions speak for themselves." Her words offered some comfort, and he nodded, grateful for her guidance. "You're right. I just need to focus on the work ahead. We have that workshop coming up next week, and I want it to be impactful." As they prepared for the workshop, Colton felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew that the event would be a pivotal moment for both him and the community. They planned to invite residents to share their experiences with law enforcement, creating a safe space for dialogue and understanding. The day of the workshop arrived, and the community center buzzed with energy. Residents filled the seats, some familiar faces from the Coffee with a Cop events, but many new ones as well. Colton felt a mix of excitement and nerves as he stood at the front of the room alongside Lisa. "Welcome, everyone," Lisa began, her voice confident. "We're here today to foster open communication and understanding between the police and the community. This is a space for you to share your stories, your concerns, and your hopes for the future. We want to hear from you." Colton stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Thank you all for being here. I know some of you may still have doubts about me and the police department, and I completely understand that. I'm here to listen and learn, and I'm committed to making changes that will benefit us all." As the workshop progressed, community members shared their experiences. Some were painful, others filled with hope. Colton listened intently, taking notes and nodding along as they spoke. Each story painted a picture of the challenges they faced, the interactions they had with police, and the desire for a better relationship. One woman stood up, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke. "I've lived in this town for over 20 years, and I've had my fair share of run-ins with the police. It's not always a friendly experience. I just want to feel safe and respected, like my voice matters." Colton's heart ached for her. "Thank you for sharing that. Your voice absolutely matters, and I want to do everything I can to ensure that all residents feel safe and respected in this community." The workshop continued, and as it wrapped up, Colton felt a profound sense of connection to the community. He had come to understand that their struggles were not just theirs, they were shared experiences that could bring about change if they were addressed together. Later that evening, as he sat down to reflect on the day, Colton felt an overwhelming sense of hope. It was still a long road ahead, but the conversations they had started would be the foundation for a stronger, more unified community. He was no longer just an officer. He was a part of something bigger, a movement toward real change. Weeks turned into months, and the changes began to take root within the community and the police department. The initiatives Colton and Lisa had worked on together were gaining traction, and they began to see more community involvement in policing efforts. The workshops continued, fostering dialogue and understanding, and Colton felt more at ease each time he stood in front of the community. One day, as Colton was wrapping up a training session, he received an unexpected phone call. It was the mayor's office, inviting him to speak at the upcoming town hall meeting about the progress they had made since the incident. He felt a mix of pride and apprehension. Speaking publicly again would mean facing the town again, but this time it was to celebrate the steps they had taken together. As he stood at the podium that evening, the lights shining down on him, he scanned the audience. Faces he recognized from the workshops, people who had once been wary of him, now smiled with encouragement. He felt the weight of their expectations, but also the support that surrounded him. "Good evening, everyone," Colton began, his voice steady. "I stand before you today, not just as Officer Colton, but as a member of